is Cassidy Warren, and thanks to my helpful mentor, Professor Dr. Alice Miller, I would like to inform you all today about the 1994 Rwandan genocide. So going back to the start of imperialism, there were two main groups in Rwanda, the Tutsi, who were a wealthy ruling party, as well as a minority of the population, and the Hutu, who were the commoners that made up a majority of the population. Over the years, tensions with the two groups grew, and in 1990 the tensions broke into civil war. But what really led to the explosion of the Rwandan genocide was on April 6, 1994, when the plane carrying Juvenal Habyarimana, the Rwandan president, was shot down over the capital city of Kigali. This was the start of the Rwandan genocide, which lasted 4 months, April through July, ultimately causing the death of 800,000 Rwandans, many of which who were Tutsi. My thesis is this: what truly made the Rwandan genocide gruesome was the involvement and lack of involvement from Western civilizations. Germany's early strive for new imperialism and France's uncontrolled use of foreign aid money as involvement in the genocide caused long-lasting ethnic tensions that made the bloodshed much worse. On the other side, the United States choice to not jam the Rwandan radio stations, and Britain, who believed that helping would bring no benefits to itself, both resulted in the Rwandans' plea for help going completely unheard. During the early 19th century, the scramble for Africa was an opportunity for Germany, who wanted to grow as a world power. The divide between the Hutu and the Tutsis had been manageable before this, but tensions started to grow with Germany's version of imperialism. Germany helped to instill the separation of both groups by distributing ethnic identity cards to systemize the restriction of administrative jobs and higher education to Tutsis. On top of this, Germany's influence and friendly nature with ruling Tutsi families helped to give them a sense of superiority over Hutu. This superiority became the reason behind the unfair taxes and amount of labor towards the Hutu, excluding the Tutsi from paying any taxes at all. The Hutu people were expected not only to pay all the heavy taxes, but work hard labor for Tutsi chiefs. Germany's new imperialistic goals not only stirred up ethnic tensions, but formed a flawed Rwandan economy, which led to the horrors of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. German missionaries had first come to Rwanda in search of rich soil for coffee cultivation. Due to Germany's need for new imperialistic and global market power, Rwandan farmers were strongly encouraged to plant mostly coffee plants. Because of this, the main flaw in their economy, being solely focused on coffee and not branching outward towards other products, Germany's colonial influence on the Rwandan coffee economy was ultimately limiting, resulting in the total economic crisis, which was used to further divide the horrors of the Rwandan genocide. Rwanda had built up a considerable amount of debt during this economic crisis, so much so that they had to rely on foreign aid money to try to right itself. France was one of the leading countries involved with the genocide, as an attempt to a military front to keep the peace, gave foreign aid money to help right the economy, and tried to help their corrupt government with a political change. While all these things might have been in hopes that Rwanda would get better, it all ended up making the bloodshed much worse. In an attempt to bring the Rwandan genocide to an end, the French government dispatched an ambitious French military presence in southwest Rwanda that was couched in humanitarian terms but had the effect of facilitating the retreat of those responsible for the crimes. Instead of catching the murderers so that they could not do any further harm, they were still running free in Rwanda. On top of this, the French foreign aid money was used to purchase the military hardware to arm their rapidly expanding military and paramilitary groups. France in general made it easily possible for the purchase of weapons, but had no control over how the corrupt government would use the foreign aid money. Before the genocide, French President Mitterrand, in an attempt to control the Rwandan government and help control the foreign aid, told the Rwandan president that future economic aid would be linked to political democratization and establishment of the multi-party system. This was an attempt to save the corrupt government by creating an equal balance of Hutu and Tutsi voices. The Rwandan president agreed to the French president's terms, but this only caused an increased tension between the two groups. The tensions that had started with German imperialism were about to explode completely with the French's attempt at curing their one-sided government. The French's involvement in the genocide gave the British government a reason to stay out of the conflict. The French argued that there was an Anglo-Saxon plot emanating in part of Uganda to build Anglophone influence in the region. The French's accusations of this caused the British to step away, not wanting to be bundled up in the scandal. Britain's main interest at the time of Rwanda lay elsewhere. Britain's foreign policy agenda at the time was focused on the crisis in the Balkans and South Africa's transition from white minority rule. Rwanda was simply outside of Britain's sphere of influence. For most of the Rwandan genocide, Britain decided to stay out of the conflict. The only time they spoke up was to call for immediate ceasefire with both political groups. If this would have happened, according to British policy, it would have allowed Hutu to continue their massacres on the Tutsi people and create an opportunity for the Hutus to gain control of the government areas. Even Britain's actions after the Rwandan genocide were poorly in support of the cause. The Prime Minister at the time, John Major, spoke about how an entirely new effort at a preventative diplomacy is long overdue with our friends in Africa, and how Britain wants to develop a new mechanism to head off conflicts before they become unstoppable. While Major's speech was in favor of more support for African countries, he never once mentioned his greatest failure, the Rwandan genocide. After the genocide, Britain pledged £200,000 over 2 years to treat genocide witnesses with AIDS, but has not offered treatment to the wider population of rape victims. The foreign aid money was a big step towards potential relief for victims of the genocide, but it left out rape victims, who were a majority of the population, making it seem that the British government was only providing a small amount of relief to make itself look good. During the 1994 Rwandan genocide, there had been a lot of conflict over places worth sending the UN forces, especially British and US troops. The Presidential Decision Directive 25 was finalized by President Clinton, stating the points that would qualify the need for peacekeeping. Britain and US both used these points to argue that under these new guidelines and in order to prevent a repeat of the disaster in Somalia, the UN had little business being in Rwanda. The British and the United States were tired of the UN failed operations of peace like the one in Somalia, where 18 US soldiers had lost their lives. The United States could have helped end the Rwandan genocide early by jamming the corrupt radio stations, but ultimately the U.S. decided not to get involved. The United States' reasoning behind their lack of interference with the radio was that it would be too costly at about $4 million in total and would break international law. State Department officials concluded that the United States should not interrupt RTML broadcasts. These radio broadcasts have been one of the leading factors in the killings, with brutal messages to kill Tutsi people. Even if it would have been costly, the U.S. would have been able to save thousands of lives. Just like Britain, the U.S. tried its best to stay out of the Rwandan genocide. Even with the news on CNN about the stirring of the genocide in Rwanda, the United States refrained from classifying events in Rwanda as genocide. This would create many legal obligations that the U.S. was not willing to fulfill at that time. Even as the United States refused to consider the conflict in Rwanda as genocide, there had been multiple bits of evidence proving otherwise. Some of which appear in the Washington Post stating, "You cockroaches must know you are made of flesh. We won't let you kill, we will kill you." The radio message directed towards Tutsis was an obvious act of genocide. It was a clear call for the deaths of thousands of Tutsis in an attempt at cleansing the population. The Washington Post was trying to make it quite clear towards the officials in the U.S. government that this indeed was genocide. If this wasn't proof enough to be considered genocide, the Rwandan radio station also played music by Simon Bikindi, whose famous songs including "I Hate Hutus" and "Sons of the Fathers of Farmers" were sung by many of the killers as they hacked or beat to death hundreds of thousands of Tutsis with government-issued machetes and homemade nailed clubs. There was loads of evidence suggesting the violence in Rwanda, and all the United States had to do was admit that. But like Britain, the U.S. chose not to see what was right in front of them. The involvement of Germany in its desire for imperialism and France's lack of control on foreign aid made Rwanda become an even bloodier war zone. The United States' lack of involvement with the radio jamming and Britain's limited view of self-interest made the Rwandan genocide last much longer than it should have. My conclusion for today is that most of the world sat and watched as the horrors of the genocide raged on. I'd like to thank my professor, Dr. Miller, who pushed me to finding the facts and helping me to revise my work. Thanks to Valencia's writing program, whose advice is extremely helpful when I was trying to perfect my drafts. And this presentation was conducted as a part of an assignment for a modern Western civilization. Thank you all so much for listening to me today, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.